Welcome into college football overtime. My name is Garrett Chapman. His name is Abe Gordon. Some people stop for the offseason. I don't know what an offseason is because college football happens each and every day, and we love to talk about it right here on the College Football Overtime podcast. So thank you so much for joining us. No matter how you're joining us, whether it's on podcast, whether it's on YouTube, just make sure you're liked, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're following along all offseason long as we get into the dark days of the season. But you know what? We got plenty to talk about right here on the College Football Overtime podcast. We have some drama between the NCAA and Tennessee. We might have had the straw that broke the camel's back, and we're going to discuss that right here. Plus, the Big 12 released its upcoming schedule. They've expanded to 16 teams. Let's see what that schedule looks like. But before we do any of that, I got to welcome in my co-host, Dave Gordon. How you doing, buddy?
You know, I was really prepared for it to actually slow down, and then we get the bombshell dropped on us a couple days ago. So that is certainly not the case, and this one actually may ultimately kind of change the landscape more than anything else we've dealt with in the past couple of years, which is wild considering how crazy the landscape has been over the course of those years. But this is a big one. Excited to dive into it with you.
Yeah, so let's just jump in. Let's just jump right in. But before we do that, California and Florida, let's go back to 2020, back when they changed the law and they allowed 16 months for the NCAA to do something about it. They said, well, effectively, our athletes can profit off of their name, image, and likeness. We don't think it's fair. California and Florida both did that. Other states promptly followed suit. And that's really where we got into this name, image, and likeness sort of debacle. And then in their infinite genius, the NCAA sort of holds a couple of meetings and they say that, hey, we'll do something about it. We'll see what we can do. We'll produce some guide rails. This will be fine. And then July 2021 rolls around and nothing happened. Nothing at all. And they effectively just prayed for government intervention, which, of course, anybody in their right mind, they know that that's really the best course of action, right? Well, what happened now is they are effectively, and correct me if I'm wrong, retroactively punishing universities and institutions for their inability to promote fair play, provide some guidelines. Same thing that we saw with all this transfer portal stuff with Tez Walker and with North Carolina. And then they tell him that he can't play. He doesn't play for the first couple of games of the season. And then seemingly overnight, they just say, hey, actually, you can play. You should just blame your institution for not being able to file paperwork properly, which, yeah, we absolutely know that was that's exactly the reason that Tez Walker couldn't play. It wasn't the fact that you realized that you were an institution that should be there to support the student athletes, not support whatever the money grubbing individuals were. And now, of course, we have what's going on with Tennessee. And one of the programs that they have isolated is Tennessee. And they are trying to effectively punish them for some impermissible benefits that were provided during the recruitment for five-star quarterback Nico. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. I still haven't gotten that down yet. I'm still working on it. Nico, I promise I'll do better next time. But I cannot pronounce his last name super effectively, so he's just going to be known as Nico here. And they're giving them level 1 and level 2 violations, which at this point would be a second violation because, of course, Jeremy Pruitt went through his whole issue with the McDonald's bags and handing out cash, and that's fine. That's one thing. That's a different thing entirely, and I'm not going to address that. This is mostly on the NCAA for not providing any sort of guide rails, any sort of recommendations, any sort of penalties, and now trying to retroactively punish the University of Tennessee. And Tennessee, they're now coming full throttle back at the NCAA. The chancellor of the Tennessee program, Donde Plowman, basically says that they had, quote, 2.5 years of vague and contradictory NCAA memos that have created chaos that NCAA member institutions and student athletes are, quote, struggling to navigate. They're suing the NCAA for their negligence, and I support them.
So there's a lot of interesting angles to pick at on this one, Garrett. And let's start at the beginning. The problem started at the same time NIL began. I mean, there's other problems before that, but it really does start with the introduction of NILs and collectives and that whole industry. And the problem was The NCAA was given time to find ways to regulate it properly, and they did not. And I know there are issues with different states having different laws, and the NCAA kind of just let every state pick their own setup. That's why we are where we are now. Now, let's fast forward to some of the conversations you and I have had just in the last 2 weeks, Garrett. We have stressed our concern about the collectives and their abilities to govern properly to benefit the schools. That's not necessarily it is their goal. They're trying to make their school's football team better, but ultimately they're playing by whatever rules they feel they want to play by. And this is where you have issues now, is that a lot of these things that the NCAA is looking at is done by a collective, not by the school. And so their inability to regulate at the start of this, at the front end, has now led to people on the back end finding ways to get benefits that shouldn't be given out. And it's essentially impossible for the schools to regulate because you're not allowing the schools to control the money. It's got to be a collective that's not tied to the school. And so it all comes all the way back to the idea of this was always going to happen at some point because the schools were not in charge of the money. And you and I have talked about this so much the last 2 weeks from both sides in terms of collectives seem like at some point they could be fraud. It could be a scam to they're not actually benefiting the students. It's a money-making industry, all of the different angles we've touched on. And it's now led to this. And it's a situation where this could have been avoided with the proper regulation. It could have been avoided with a little bit of foresight. I think is the other aspect of this. How did you not see this coming? How did you not see? Because how did you not see stuff not affiliated directly with the school not cheating? I mean, it's like it was always going to happen at some point that way. And look, we'll talk about it here in a couple of moments. But now you look at the big picture, and I don't know if it's as drastic as everyone's kind of jumping to, but it might be. I mean, the question is left there, Garrett, because it's not just Tennessee. It's going to be other schools. It's going to be other states. Is this again? We have to kind of big picture it here, and I want to hear your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the beginning of the end for the NCAA as it relates to college football? I think ultimately, and we don't know the timeline for this answer, but I think ultimately that's probably where it's headed.
Yeah, no, this is where we're heading, and this has been where we've been heading for, I'd say, a number of years now, and really, this comes from the injunction that Tennessee and Virginia filed, and look, they made this. It may not be the end of the NCAA per se, but it would be the end of NCAA enforcement. Which, if you remove their teeth, then I don't really know what their point is anymore. And we talk about them as a governing body. They're really the only option that has existed in college athletics. That's it. And I'm not saying, and like, look, at the end of the day, it's like if the NCAA goes away, it would create a power vacuum that would need to be filled by something. So I think the next question is if their teeth are taken away, which it sounds like that's the direction that we're going in, assuming that Tennessee gets their way on this, which I think there's a very good chance that they do. Otherwise, I don't think that they would be pushing back as hard as they are right now. They really, really, really think that they have a good shot at this. And if they do get their way, which I'm assuming they will, then the NCAA loses its teeth and we don't know who steps in. And then that leads us to the new future of college football, which has long been the future of college football, which is just super conferences. And that's where the football alone steps away and breaks off and creates its own new division and its own league of sorts where you can create, you can collectively bargain with the athletes. They can receive compensation. You can uh, align media rights deals along evenly throughout all of these programs. And I don't know if that's necessary. All of these things are going to happen necessarily, but you have to open the possibility, the door to that possibility, because that's just where we are in college athletics. If you want to see college athletics continue, which I think, based off of the amount of people that I see who listen to this podcast, based off of the amount of people who watch those national championship games, based off the amount of people who watch a mundane ESPN Plus game on whatever platform, like, people want to watch this sport continue because it's meaningful and it matters to a lot of people. And in order to preserve that sport, they need to get away from the NCAA and get away from the NCAA as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it feels like a fast forward to where we're ultimately are going to be headed.
Yes.
But it just I'm so befuddled by the fact that we had how many different parties begging for regulations for how many years now, in Congress, in their state assembly, like wherever they could, they've been saying time and time again, this needs to be regulated. It needs to be regulated. It needs to be like one central rule we all abide by. It wasn't. And now you find yourself sitting in this position here. So at the end of the day, whatever the future holds, whether it's NCAA or not NCAA, whether it's some of the schools that are involved and others are separated, or it's all the schools involved, whatever it is, you've got to get to a point where there's like one agreed upon set of regulations and bylaws and what you can do and what you cannot do in regards to these players, because they're always going to try and find their advantages, skirting the lines, whatever it may be. And if you're dealing with 50 different rules in 50 different states, it's going to be an absolute nightmare for the sport. I mean, look, the sport itself is okay. It's the second most popular sport in the country. It's not dying down anytime soon. But there are aspects of it that are in trouble. And so I think that, to me, is the biggest concern, is how quickly can you find a pathway towards universal regulations and legislation on this, because it didn't matter who asked for it, whether it was the all-powerful Nick Saban, state senators, congressmen, whatever. We've asked for legislation on this for how many years now, Garrett? 6, going on 6 years, 7 years, whatever the number is.
Yeah.
And we haven't gotten anywhere with it. I think this is a real kind of wake-up call into the fact that if you didn't think we need legislation before, like, this really should be the final straw to, like, get it done, figure it out, or we're going to have a dramatically different. And again, the sport itself will not change. The sport of college football, in terms of lining up on Saturdays, is not going to be dramatically different. But the other aspects of it, where money comes from, how money is divvied out, conference, I mean, all of that stuff could be up for grabs based on where we spin this and where this all ends up. And look, I compared it earlier today. To me, this is like the Italian mobster that makes the power play, and it only ends two ways. It only ends up on top or 6 feet under. There is no settling back in and controlling parts of this. Like, if you're the NCAA, this is your power play, and you chose to make it right now. And you either solidify your standing and end up on top, or where we all seem to think it's headed, you made a miscalculation, a gross miscalculation, which is what this appears to be with the way that Tennessee is fighting it, and you're going to end up 6 feet under. That's kind of the way I take a look at it. And I don't know if you feel the same, but I mean, you know me, I'm a movie guy, and it kind of feels like that's what's going on.
Yeah, the Corleone family doing what they got to do to stay on top. Yeah, I understand that reference completely, but
Yeah.
really, I think I have a slightly different timeline than you do, just based off of just what I've seen. So I'm going to take you back to 2020. And of course, not a lot of people like to remember 2020. Of course, we were in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of, like, the NCAA cancels cancels March Madness and the College World Series, and we're into the summer months, and a lot of programs start saying, or conferences and the NCAA in general are saying, nope, fall's canceled. We're not doing anything. And Greg Sankey stood up and said, no, we're going to wait, and we're not going to cancel anything. And there was a lot of pushback, and a lot of people were calling for him, and like they were saying he was doing something terrible, whatever. And care where you stand on that. You and anybody who's listening, it doesn't matter. That's not the point of this conversation. That is when we ended up having a season, and everybody else came back into the fold and they followed his lead. That was really, in my mind, one of the first times that somebody stood up to the NCAA, said, we're going to do it our way, and they called their bluff. And the NCAA folded. The rest of the conferences all folded, and they all followed suit. And I understand that, like, in this day and age, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey, they dictate the future of the sport, whether they like to admit it or not. They're the two most important power brokers in college football, in college athletics in general, but specifically college football. And when Greg Sankey stood up and made that decision, and then everybody else just sort of followed suit soon after, that's when you realize the NCAA is in over its head, and we're past them. And that's just true as a sport.
Just to double back on your point, because I think you're making a great thing. The other problem for the NCAA is it starts with Tennessee, but you've got other member institutions in the SEC that are going to back Tennessee. And what starts is one, Georgia backs them. They don't like whatever. Florida backs them. You get Texas, and it jumps into the big. And now now that's where the problem really becomes an issue. If this were San Diego State trying to fight the NCAA, we're probably having a different discussion. In fact, it's probably barely being covered by the national media. But it's not, and we can already see where it's headed. And you're right. College football goes as the SEC goes, whether Big Ten people like it or not. That's just the truth. And for it to start here in the SEC, and look, they are fierce competitors, but you know that every other school in the SEC looks at this as, we can't let them do something we're not doing, sort of thing. And it's going to snowball. I would imagine relatively quickly. Now, that doesn't mean this whole process plays out quickly. But I think in terms of teams coming and siding with Tennessee, like you're kind of suggesting that they did back in the era of a potentially canceled season. I think you get enough backing and it starts to become the movement. I agree with you.
Yeah, because you just follow the timeline of what the NCAA has done since COVID. It's just been consistently them trying to swing wildly and try to regain some of that lost power. And since that COVID-19, it's like they've swung wildly and missed. And they've only ceded more and more and more and more power, because they tried to go to the government and say, they went to the Supreme Court. They argued in front of the Supreme Court. One of their arguments was that people prefer to watch amateur athletics compared to paid athletes, which is just insane, but not the point. The point is they lost. They lost that argument. They spent tens of millions of dollars fighting against name, image, and likeness, and they lost. And then they had a chance to set up guide rails. They didn't do it. Then they had a chance to say, hey, well, you have to do this. As far as the transfer portal is concerned, they lost that battle then too. They have consistently ceded more and more and more and more and more control until we are at this point now, which I feel like it's a breaking point, that we are plain and simple, because this feels like they are wildly swinging their fists, and they just connected with somebody who punches back.
Yeah, again, when I think over what led us to these issues, it still goes back to the refusal to allow schools to control these decisions. Like that's really the base of it. Like, the whole idea of collectives having the money is what has put you in this situation. And we ask for legislation, we ask guidelines and regulations, all that stuff. But to allow entities that, while they would like to support the school but are not directly affiliated by the school, probably do not understand the NCAA bylaws and what is and isn't allowed. Like, you were always going to end up with this. And you're going to get into a situation like you have now with Tennessee, where they're like, well, you wouldn't give us control. What do you expect from us? And it could have been handled. There should have been foresight to foresee that. I mean,
they went to court instead.
Yeah,
they went to the Supreme Court, and then they tried their battle, and then they just sat on their hands.
The only path back, in my opinion, for the NCAA, and not that there is one at this point, but if there's going to be one, it is a plan for legislation and regulation. And I don't know if at this point that would be enough. But that's the only path back, because if you can't provide that, the schools will find a way to bring it upon themselves to do so. And if that's the plan, if that's the roadmap they have to follow, you're no longer involved, which is what you've been discussing and setting up this whole time anyways. Now, whether that leads to the other discussion of payers are played directly, employees of the I mean, who knows? Who knows? I think ultimately that's probably the simplest answer in terms of controlling the money. And I don't mean controlling money in the way the collectives do it. I mean in terms of fairly divvying out what is allowed. But you opened up the Wild West with, I mean, at least in Wild West towns, when you go into a new city, the sheriff checks your guns and says no guns allowed in this town. When you're ready to leave, check out. Like there wasn't even that. Like there wasn't even that. I know I'm making like a lot of terrible movie references, but and you kind of know what I'm getting at though. Like you just welcomed them into town, and it was a free for all. I was like, you should have known you can't just free for all. That there are some things you can do while you're here, and then some things you can do after you move on. And so that just wasn't how they played it. So I don't know. I got to get off the movie references. They're not exactly direct, but I think you get the gist.
Yeah, no, you need a Doc Holliday or something like that just to kind of control things a little bit. But
Wyatt
you know
Earp
what?
Hold on, because now you screwed it up. Wyatt Earp was the Doc Holliday is the villain theoretically.
No,
Wyatt
you're right.
Earp's
You're
the
right.
sheriff.
I guess
so
you're right. You're right.
You get some OK Corral history. Let's go.
Okay, come on. Great movie. If you haven't watched Tombstone, go check it out. That's actually a movie that's back on my list of rewatch, like movies I want to rewatch. Great movie. But hey, let's move into something a little less complicated. I guess the Big 12 released its schedule. You could maybe this is more complicated than the NCAA losing all control of college football and athletics.
Well, at least
as we know
look. It may be more complicated. At least it's written down on paper, and we know exactly what we're looking at.
Who's playing who and at what on what day and at what location.
At least we have an idea,
and we have a rule book that they're going to play the football games by, and then we know when they're going to play in a conference championship game. At least we have that, because you know what, that matters. Because each game that's being played is played by the same set of rules theoretically, right? Well, we can hope, but the NCAA is doing its own thing. I'm not going to. They kill me. The Big 12. Yeah. They, of course, expanded to 16 teams just to match what the SEC, the Big 10, all these other conferences are doing right now. And your Power 4, as it stands right now, you got 16 teams in the Big 12. You got 16 teams in the SEC. You have 17 teams in the ACC. And the Big 10 is not the Big 10. It's the Big 18 now. And you have the Atlantic Coastal Conference, which spans from Pacific to Atlantic. But nothing makes sense in college athletics anymore. Let's just put it out there. So they added UCF, BYU, Cincinnati, and Houston last year. This year, in comes Colorado and Deion Sanders, Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah. They're all going to play 9 conference games alongside the Big 10. We can have that discussion, too, if you want to talk about however many conference games they want to play. Because the SEC and the ACC are only playing 8 conference games. My whole thought with the conference games is, I don't really care, but that's something where we can go back to our conversation that we were just having about if you have a single governing body, everybody would play by the same rules, which means you're playing the same number of conference games, right?
Yeah, a couple of things here. I guess, this is probably more talk we should have had. I don't think we were actually doing the podcast back then, but when it was announced that they were expanding into the teams that are welcoming in from the Pac-12. I think that is a good step for the Big 12. Obviously, losing Texas and Oklahoma is a killer. There's no denying that. Massive. But the teams you mentioned that came into the conference a year ago, Houston, BYU, UCF, and Cincinnati, that's a serious step back in terms of relevance for the conference. And say what you will, but Colorado, Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah, that's moving back into the direction you needed it to move. So I do think it's good that they were able to accomplish that. That being said, there are almost no rivalries in this conference. You and I were talking about it beforehand. You can force whatever fake name or fake trophy game you want, but with the exception of Arizona State, and the Holy War, there's really just there's just really not a lot of traditional rivalries people are going to care about.
You don't like Farmageddon?
Like I said, you can throw whatever
Iowa State, it's
throw whatever fake
trophy,
fake name you want in there, but no, it's not a traditional rivalry. And I've always felt like you got one big one, right?
Red River.
And if Iowa State's the big one, then that one can't be. So, that if Kansas State's the big one, then the other ones can't be. So, yeah, you keep some of them, but it is odd to see, and there's a lot of mixing and matching some of the new teams and some of the old teams. Ultimately, though, it's an underwhelming schedule. It just is, and it's very tough to look at this schedule and say these are going to be the games people are paying attention to on a given week. Yeah. In the background, like when I look at it, all right, so you know me, right? I've got the 4-screen set up here at home. How many times are one of these games going to be higher than TV3? I mean, you're really stretching it. Maybe there's
the best games that happen in this conference are with people not in the conference.
Right.
I think I'm looking at Colorado, their game with Nebraska. I'm interested in just because Nebraska is going to be an interesting team next year.
Well,
and Colorado is just
and this is where we now get to the amount of conference games. And say what you will about
before you say that, it's literally only because Texas and Oklahoma are gone. They tried to replicate
for conference, yes, the in-conference schedule, yeah, for sure.
To replicate what those two were. That as far as national relevance is concerned, I don't care about UCF. UCF doesn't care about playing BYU or maybe they do Cincinnati because of their old American days. But UCF versus Arizona, I don't care about that. You talk about Utah versus Houston. Okay, great. I mean, they're fun college football games. I mean, BYU Utah is relevant just because it's the Holy War. But Texas versus Kansas State was an exciting game because it's Texas. That's why.
Oklahoma let me ask you this question. Here's the question.
That's it.
You were in a situation over the past number of years in the Big 12 where if you beat Texas or you beat Oklahoma, it almost made your season.
That's a meaningful
There
way.
is no team now in the conference where you're like, if you beat them, that made your season. Like that team doesn't exist anymore, or it might change year to year. If you beat Texas, whether they were up or down, it didn't matter. You beat Texas. Yeah. There is no team in there. Yeah, there's no team like that anymore.
Blood. Every conference had a blue blood. Like you go to the Pac-12, it's USC, it's an Oregon, or it's like, and then the other ones change, but they're also not. They were like the lowest of the level. Yeah. The Big 12, obviously, it's Oklahoma and Texas. The SEC, it changes by the year, of course, but it's Alabama and Georgia and those kinds of teams. Right, they just have a lot of them. And then you go to the Big 10, and it's Penn State, it's Michigan, it's Ohio State. It's consistent. Like those are your top programs, and you know who those teams are. And whenever those teams play, people are going to be tuning in, whether you're a fan of that program or you hate that program, And right now in the Big 12, there's no juice. Like there's nothing that gets me excited.
Now, can I get into the conference
yes,
schedule?
You can get into the.
So here's the thing. Here's the thing but the argument you just made is why they should be in line with the SEC on a 9-game schedule. Because I would be infinitely more interested in Utah playing Wisconsin or whoever, BYU playing UNC. Sure. Like the extra conference game doesn't give you any juice. Whereas I think playing a non-conference game would give you a little bit more juice, especially if you can get it against the top tier programs in other conferences. And I think that's what we've seen out of the SEC. And this is the concern about these 10-game conference schedules. And look, maybe it'll be different. We don't know the landscape necessarily, how it would play out with a 12-team playoff, and how having one loss or two losses doesn't kill you every year. But
Sure.
the fact that we have Alabama versus Texas, Georgia's versus Oregon's or Clemson's, Virginia Tech and Ohio State. I don't know if that, but you get my point.
Yeah.
Like the fact that we have those at multiple times in the first, say, month of the season, whether it's the kickoff game or week 2, like Alabama, Texas was, or even some later into September, like that only happens because it's a 9-game schedule, in my opinion. And I wish the Big 12 and the ACC would consider that, because I would love to see more cross-conference, not rivalries, but agreements. And I think that does die down with the with the 10-game schedule. You just don't have as many opportunities for that. And so that's for me is why I prefer the 9-game schedule. And look, some teams don't schedule the big boys, right? They use that to schedule scrubs, and you have to accept that. But on the national scale, I think being able to schedule power versus power is so important, and it's so much more relevant than seeing BYU Baylor. Like it just is. And so for me, that's why I like the 9-game schedule and give teams opportunities to get on the national stage a little bit more.
Yeah, and I can't speak completely to all of this, but locking in opponents too,
Yeah.
like whether it's Houston versus like Texas Tech or something, or Baylor versus TCU, and that's one of those things. Like the SEC has done such a fantastic job about this, just in particular. Georgia and Florida is on Halloween every year. Then you have the third Saturday in October, and you have like all of these awesome rivalry games that it's like a clock. It's like, and they're going to hit this week, and this is what's going to happen. And it's like, hey, this is that week, and you look forward to that game for 365 days, and that's meaningful. And in this schedule, it's like you kind of lose a lot of that. There's just, and I like where you're getting with that, and I think that it's an interesting prospect, I'd say, for the Big 12, but I think all of this is temporary. It's all temporary, just until we move into the future of what the college sport is going to look like. Right now, it's just trying to keep your head above water. And as it stands right now, the Big 12 and the ACC, they're doing everything that they can do. But I think it's pretty telling when you have your big releases and everything else, and everybody's paying attention to what the SEC and the Big Ten are doing, and then you do yours, and it's kind of like a footnote on the story.
Oh, you had like source leaks, 36 hours before the Georgia schedule. Like, here's one of the games.
And
Same with
everyone's
Tennessee.
freaking out.
Here's one of their games, and
Yeah.
the whole Big 12 got released. You're like, okay, man. Like they didn't have a
Go.
special. They didn't have
Nothing.
a TV special for it. I mean, you're like, okay, man, cool. Let's see. And looking down the list, 164 games, and I'm not interested in any of them. Not a damn one. So yeah, that's unfortunately the state of things.
The funniest thing is that I like a lot of these Big 12 teams.
We'll watch the game. We are college football fans. We're going to watch the games.
Yeah.
But the draw nationally
I don't know
is
man. Like I say, they're treading water, but it's like, dude, they're treading water with weights attached to their feet right now.
Feels like a lot of noon kickoffs on ESPN too.
Ugh. And that's just brutal, man. I just,
or they might be in the Fox deal. I don't know. Whoever the hell
they're on the Fox deal. They're on the Fox deal.
Just feels like you're not getting much prime time coverage.
Where's Big Noon Kickoff going for any of these games? Because their other partner is up in the Big Ten, and you're going to have Washington and Michigan playing each other in a rematch of the national championship game. And then you have your ex Texas, who's going up to play Michigan, and like there's nothing like that. There's no juice. There's no excitement. There's nothing about it. And I think that's just where we stand in this landscape right now. I think there's a lot. The next set of conversation, I guess, is going to be centered around which conference goes next. Then it's looking increasingly like the ACC. Of course, we have Florida State that's in their whole debacle with the conference, and we'll see what ends up coming from that. But the Big 12,
I will say this. I just looked at their schedule again, and it is probably something they're going to need to do more of this year and into next year. A lot of games do have like Friday or Saturday availability. There's like one or two a week or one every week. I think for this conference, that Friday game, I know there's a lot of arguments against playing Friday football. We don't need to get into that now. But in terms of getting seen on a national TV scale, especially if you could start it later in the night, right? Like a 9 o'clock kickoff, 9 Eastern, something like that. That might be something they take hold of as well.
I guess I don't know. Like, who do you want to watch your sport? You a lot of your football fans are.
Bro, I go out to
your
a sports
recruits.
bar every Friday night and have some drinks. If you could tell me, I can tell them to put on whatever channel it's going to be on at 9:30 at night, and I can start to watch college football. I mean, I'm in.
I guess, man. I guess. I feel like Friday is sacred, and but I guess nothing is sacred in this new era of college football. But we'll see what ends up happening. We're going to keep you guys updated on everything right here on the College Football Overtime podcast throughout the course of the offseason. As bitter and long and unfortunate as it is, we'll be here to keep you company. So make sure you're liked, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you are tuning in every single time we drop a new episode. And we thank you so much for joining us right here on the College Football Overtime podcast. We're going to be seeing you again on Monday morning, so make sure you're tuned in right here. Till next time, his name is Abe Gordon. My name is Garrett Chapman. We'll see you Monday.